Now, Mr. Fein, Congressman Paul is the first and perhaps the only candidate for the Republican nomination who's put out a very detailed map of where he wants the federal budget to go. And in his budget proposal, he says he's going to balance the budget in 4 years, and he's going to cut $1 trillion a year. And a lot of these budget proposals that people hear about state $1 trillion in cumulative terms. They'll say 10 years and we'll cut $1 trillion. But Congressman Paul is going to end up doing in 1 year. Could you talk about how Congressman Paul gets from here to there with the federal budget?
Yes, and let's begin with the largest element, I think, that can be cut, in fact, strengthen the security of the United States. That's the current $1.2 trillion we expend on a national security issues. $1.2 trillion. That's more spending than the combined defense budgets of the entire world combined. So that is totally unnecessary because his defense platform is different than all other candidates for the Republican nomination as well as President Obama. It can be stated very simply in an echo of the Founding Fathers. Millions for defense, not 1 cent for empire. We are spending staggering sums. For example, $120, $130 billion in Afghanistan, or $350 million a day for fighting maybe 50 Al-Qaeda. Totally, for Al-Qaeda are terrible criminals. We need to defend against that. We do not need to declare a war with that extravagant spending, 100,000 troops there. And I want your audience to think about this comparison. If the troop-to-enemy ratio that now obtains for the United States in Afghanistan were employed in World War II in fighting the far more sophisticated and potent Japanese and German armies, we would have fielded a armed force of 3.5 billion. I mean, we would have had to multiply the entire population by 126 even to get there if we were to conscript everyone. That's an example of what Congressman Paul recognized, this empire mentality, which seeks to have a risk-free existence. The tiniest threat then causes the United States to declare de facto or de jure war and expend vast sums that could be better spent defending Americans back here in the United States. Say that's a staggering sum just in Afghanistan. Think, $350 million this very day. For what? How many people get up worrying that someone out of a cave in Afghanistan is going to come and attack them?
No,
it doesn't mean we're not Pollyannish. We understand there are evil things out there, but evil things domestically too. Timothy McVeigh's, there's 17,000 murders each year. We need to be on our guard. We need to use intelligence, but we need to be involved in defense. Preemptive warfare is the antonym of defense. It is a formula for never-ending spending that's going to bankrupt us and keeps creating enemies, because when you're involved in this kind of open-ended warfare, civilians inevitably are going to be killed, and that's going to create great resentment against the United States.
Now, Mr.
So
Fein,
go ahead.
I just want to interrupt you quickly. You're certainly on a roll, but we have a list of topics we wanted to get through, and we're sort of jumping around, but they are all interconnected, and that's why the Ron Paul candidacy is so monumental and important, because it's the only one that really gets to the root of all of the problems, which you can all be linked to an economic standpoint. Now, you're talking about the terrorism, and people have a far greater chance of dying from bee stings or drowning in bathtubs or car crashes. But our reaction to this one thing of terrorism, because it's just so scary, is just so incredibly disproportionate, especially with the cost that we place on this actually really low risk. Now, I know that the one major attack that everyone points to is 9/11. We don't want another 9/11, and that was a disastrous economic loss and loss of life on one day. And that's why it resonates so strongly with people, and why it's such a great, well, I don't use the word great, but such a tremendous sticking point for the defense industry. They used it as the calling card, and how realistic is the mantra where we say we fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here? How realistic is it that Al-Qaeda is going to launch an invasion of the United States and actually bring us to our knees if we were to withdraw within our borders and not have an interventionist foreign policy?
Well, I think the likelihood is zero. And remember, I'm not trying to defend those murderers who perpetrated 9/11.
Of course not.
It's an abomination. But the fact is, even if it's not exculpatory, if the United States did not have 1,000 bases abroad, intervening in every domestic situation, whether propping up Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Shah of Iran, all these other countries, there wouldn't have been resentment. It may be true that we weren't killing anybody directly, but we were supporting regimes that created enormous resentment in their citizenry. Because those regimes are autocratic. They're hardly democratic.
So you're saying that they don't hate us for our freedom.
We could see that the tanks and the tear gas in the streets of Cairo, made in America. So that creates an anger. Now, even with that and the dastardly attacks of 9/11, Al-Qaeda never had the ability to occupy the United States, to threaten our sovereignty. They're very evil people, and when they commit crimes, we capture them, we try them, we sentence them, and even if we can impose a death penalty, as was a potential for Mr. Zacarias Moussaoui, he was the 20th hijacker, and we can, as the Israelis did to Adolf Eichmann, exercise kidnapping abroad, bring them back here for due process trials, but that is not war. War is very different than criminal law enforcement because it means the law is silent. It means the spending becomes extravagant. It means that you have indiscriminate killing because the idea is, well, you make mistakes in war, and if you're innocent, that you're collateral damage. That's why it's so important to raise the threshold, very exacting standard before you enter that twilight zone of life. And if you take even the $1.2 trillion that we're spending, it's not that we stop spending. We could probably spend a third of that, bring our troops back to defend the United States. If we're not there, it's ridiculous in my mind to think that Al-Qaeda members wake up furious that we have that of freedom in the United States, that what really makes them angry is to see a free press, free radio, to see elections being held, to see men and women on buses or on metros together, and that's what creates their great anger. That just defies reality. That's not great.
Now, Mr. Fein,
the resentment.
There's been a lot of talk in the press in the last few days about a possible war with Iran over its nuclear program. What's Congressman Paul's position on Iran?
Iran, we should not be imposing. The best way to reduce the incentive for them to develop a nuclear weapon is to stay out of their business. We tried earlier, remember, we overthrew Mossadegh, the first Democratic elected prime minister in Iranian history in 1953. We ended up with the Shah and then the Ayatollah. So our track record there isn't very good. Right. We obviously do not cherish, nuclear proliferation. But the fact is, we have been able, and we lived with it with the Soviet Union. Russia's got nuclear weapons. China has nuclear weapons. North Korea, as erratic as their rulers are, have nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. India has got nuclear weapons. Right. Israel has nuclear weapons. Right. So we do not favor nuclear weapons, but we would never go to war offensively for that purpose. Obviously, we would use a deterrent. You strike us, we will incinerate you. The deterrent worked and has worked throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War period, and I think it's ridiculous to think that these people in Iran are different and made of different DNA, even worse than North Korea, and suddenly would commit suicide by trying to attack the United States, knowing we would incinerate them.
Mr. Fein,
even with the scope of the Soviet Union, they flinched over the Cuban Missile Crisis. They didn't cherish it, and there's no evidence to suggest that the Iranians have any other quest for self-preservation than other countries.
Well, Mr. Fein, a related question. Oh, go ahead. Marchand, did you have a question for Mr. Fein?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think you make a very valid point. Somehow a man who wears welder glasses and bouffant hairdo and high heels somehow frightens me just a little bit more than Iran, which seems to be an up-and-coming developing country.
And moreover, has a history of culture. Cyrus the Great, Darius, great poets and whatever. And they negotiated with us over the release of our hostages in the embassy. They didn't crave, committing hara-kiri or anything like that. They have negotiated like any other power. It's not sentimental. They don't respond to morality, but what other countries do. This is realpolitik. And if we make it clear, we will destroy them if they ever attempted any kind of nuclear program against us. There's no reason to think they'd respond differently than countries with far more formidable nuclear arsenals, including the Soviet Union under Stalin over Berlin or otherwise. That would suggest that deterrence won't work.